Let's get going. So my name is Elizabeth East. I'm a director at LOUVER Gallery, and I am also the co-curator of our current exhibition, which is on view through January 16th. Titled 45 at 45, the exhibition celebrates 45 years of LOUVER through the work of 45 artists, and I'm pleased to say that we have 4 of those artists here. It's my job to introduce everyone, but we have a new format for this event. Following my introductions, I'm going to hand things over to Tony Marsh, who will lead the conversation. I will disappear off your screen, and then after about 45 minutes, I will magically reappear to take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions during the course of the conversation, or right afterwards, please add them to the Q&A or chat section function in Zoom, and we will try and get to as many as possible by the end of this session. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce people in reverse alphabetical order. And as I'm doing that, we're going to share with you an image of the installation of that artist's work in the show so that you can reference it. But we have a lot to cover today, so my introductions are going to be, I hope, pretty brief. So beginning with Matt Weidel, with whom LOUVER has worked since 2009. Matt was born in Colorado, now lives and works in Albany, Ohio. He received his MFA from Cal State Long Beach, where he studied with Tony Marsh. Matt's work can be found in collections as far afield as Qatar, Turkey, Switzerland, France, Italy, and the UK. Over the past year, Matt has exhibited his work at Louisiana State University and Wichita Falls Museum of Art in Texas. And we are looking forward to a solo exhibition of his work at the Toledo Museum, or the Museum of Art in Ohio, which will open in late 2022. One thing I didn't tell you all is that I'm going to be giving a sort of a fun, as yet unknown fact about each artist. And the fun fact about Matt is that he has an extraordinary talent, and that is his ability to get a baby to fall asleep. I'm amazed, Matt. Second, Jiha Moon, who earned an MFA from Weidel University Weidel University in Seoul, South Korea, and both an MA and MFA from the University of Iowa. He currently lives and works in Atlanta, Georgia, where she teaches painting and drawing at Georgia State University. Among her many awards, she was the recipient of the prestigious Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant in 2011. And her mid-career survey exhibition titled, charmingly, Double Welcome, Most Everyone's Mad Here, curated by Amy Moorfield, toured to more than 10 museum venues around the US between 2015 and 2018. The fun fact about Jiha is that she is an authority on Asian bakeries, tea houses, and farmers markets in Atlanta. Thank you, Jiha. Third, Tia Pulitzer, native Angelino, who received her BFA in Fine Art from the Kansas City Art Institute and her MFA from UCLA. Tia is also a teacher, something in common that all our panelists have, and has taught at UCLA and Otis College of Art and Design. LOUVER first showed her work as part of our Rogue Wave exhibition program in 2009. And since 2003, Tia has been the proud owner of a dog that looks like a sheep. The dog is called a Bedlington Terrier, and according to Wikipedia, it is a versatile yet contradictory dog. Thank you, Tia. And finally, Tony Marsh, who is internationally renowned both for his art and for his teaching, including at California State University, Long Beach, where he was the chair of the ceramics art program for over 20 years. He is currently the first director of the Center for Contemporary Ceramics at CSULB. His work can be found in numerous museum collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, LACMA, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Gardner Museum of Art in Toronto, the Foshan Museum of Contemporary Art in China, to name just a few. And the fun fact about Tony is that he has a twin sister who is a foot shorter and according to Tony, much nicer. I know the latter to be humanly impossible, but I'm delighted to ask the so-called less nice, taller twin to lead our conversation today. And so I'm going to hand things over to Tony. Thank you, Tony, and thank you all for being here. And thank you to our audience. And I will see you in around 5 minutes. Bye.
Okay, so thank you so much, Elizabeth, and also to Peter Gould and the entire staff for inviting us into their gallery home for this kind of wonderful 45th anniversary exhibit, and for providing us this forum to discuss what we think and how we feel about what we do. And also, welcome to the audience. I see a lot of friends out there, old acquaintances. That's really quite nice. And it's true, my sister is much nicer than I am. So I wanted to start this conversation with Matt, and I'm just going to pose a question, and then we can all, Matt can respond, and we can all dive in and see what comes of it. So Matt, your practice, to me, I've known you for a long time, and your practice is so dynamic, and sometimes it feels as though it requires tremendous energy and kind of peak moments to do the kinds of things that you do. When it all comes together, what is it that makes you feel kind of most alive and kind of vibrant in the studio or in life? And kind of an add-on there, and you can do with this whatever you like, is what is it that your work celebrates?
Ability is not, maybe not necessarily that what my work celebrates, but I think in terms of how do we get the thing to go over to my screen? Who knows? Can everybody see me okay? I can't tell.
Yep, you're good.
All right. I think being just completely vulnerable in space, in my studio, or what I deem as my studio, and what I'm trying to think of as just my life, and not just within the confines of the studio. And like, how do I create context, conditions in the studio where I am completely uncertain and completely vulnerable, and just open as much as I can to who I might be and who I'm becoming. And I think like that space is to hold that space that can continually be unencumbered as much as possible. Because I think the things that interrupt that, they're new every day. And so like, how do you create conditions where you can be completely just purely yourself in space, even with all the complexity of what that means in terms of like your fears or images that you might deem as not legitimate. Like, how do you contend with those things, even though they're present in your space? And how do you create conditions where you can acknowledge them as presence and as kind of part of you? So I think that the vulnerability, the just kind of declaration that you kind of can be clearly yourself, for me is this kind of like act of being like fully alive and fully present. And I think I've been thinking a lot this summer about like what the definition of like the meaning of life is, with the kids. And I think it really comes down, because I homeschool my kids and I see how they navigate the world. And I think what it really comes down to is they're actively practicing everything that they do. Every single thing, they're practicing. And so like for me as an adult, as an artist, is to kind of like this idea of the meaning of life is this like active practicing of what it is to be alive, this practicing of life. And is that as a foundation for how I approach my creative practice, as this kind of condition of being fully immersed in this kind of act of understanding. So I think for me, I just can't help but just to be fully alive in that space. And I don't think, and I'm trying to learn how to not just keep it within the confines of my studio, and thinking about how to allow myself to bring that and be that kind of exploration of being in self outside of those boundaries. And And I think, so there's a lot, I'm trying to think of the questions. So your question was, how do I be alive? Or what was, so tell me again.
Well, I guess, yeah, what is it that makes you feel most deeply connected and alive in your work? If that's discussable.
I think it's like acknowledging that there's like something deep inside of me, that there's a knowledge there that's nonverbal, like a nonverbal knowledge that knows more than I do. And that, like, no matter what, if I try to kind of create this definition or declaration of what my work is, this kind of other knowledge always proves me wrong. And that, like, because I've been trying to think about, like, how am I like fully the fullest alive? Like, when like in fight or flight situations, I do really well. Like a friend of mine, well, like, there's so many instances in which traumatic things are happening and I do really good stuff. Like, I perform well, my body performs. Now my mind's not performing, but my body just knows how to function in that space. So it's this idea that, it's this idea that, that there's something that my body knows how to do that could teach me more than anything I would try to assume that I know. And so I think my practice is this way of uncovering knowledge and allowing images to be presented in my studio, and just kind of like trusting that they, trusting their presence, and like through the act of making is this kind of like declaration that that image exists, in space.
This is a bit of an offbeat follow-up there, but you're standing on a stool on a bucket, and there's something. I mean, I've always, in having watched you work over the years, I've always kind of observed this element of risk, certainly artistically, but there's also this physical element of risk that you've engaged as long as I've known you. And can you talk about risk a little bit?
I think risk comes from I think for me, I inevitably have to learn the hard way. Like, no matter, ever since I was a little child, like if something was flammable, I would see if it was flammable by lighting it on fire, like gunpowder or some crazy stuff, or gasoline. It's flammable and you light a match. That's really stupid. But like, I have to, like, I've been like burdened to learn things the hard way and just kind of exist within these kind of the framework of which I know, and that's all I can do. And there's so many like, yeah, so I think I'm getting smarter. I think I have a better stool now than I had back then. But I mean, that's one of the exciting kind of conceptual elements, I think, of my work, or that or at least with kind of these large scale ceramic objects, is there's the sense that the act of making is a conceptual element in the thing. And I think a lot of that's an interesting thing, that that the act of making, the act of like giving, allowing things to do what they must in the kiln, the idea that you would devote so much energy to kind of acknowledging an idea, or and then having to let it go, because you put it in the kiln and it'll explode or it'll crack, or so there's this kind of I don't know what that crackle. There's this kind of traumatic, like vulnerable, rich, explosive part of the creative practice that I'm not articulating that well. I think I'm nervous.
That's okay.
The idea that you would, as a maker, give something that you've devoted yourself to, and allow that thing to become something, and allow that thing to also be destroyed potentially. The idea that as a letting go as a maker is a really interesting gesture. Instead it's this kind of like letting go. It's this kind of letting go of so much. You know, you put so much into this idea, but then you have to let it go in order for it.
You know, and having watched you for over 10 years, I feel like risk and vulnerability and gift are all such important parts of your practice. I feel like those are some of the really kind of dynamic, you know, underpinnings to what you do, and to put yourself in that position is a way that you know how to be successful, you know, or to at least feel alive in what you're doing, and it brings out the best in you. I feel like when you challenge yourself in those ways, you know, that's always been very interesting to watch, and to watch you learn from your work too. I think, and solve problems. You know, it's almost like you're looking for good problems, because the way in which you solve them is usually sometimes fairly unique and kind of personal to you, and it teaches you. You know, so I've always enjoyed watching you in that way.
And I think that's a big part of my practice, is just being having it be this like psychological practice of like kind of exploring what's known and unknown, and just trying to understand the limits of how one thinks, and what presence is, and what culture is, how like what art is, how art kind of has lost its way, or what it could become in the future as like as a way of engaging life. Like those are all these huge questions that just manifest themselves in the objects that I make, and the kind of risks, or the idea that the risk and the kind of like the fear of explosions, or being crushed by your work, or putting these things in the kiln, and the kiln, you know, exploding. Like those are such rich explorations of life. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Like those in themselves, that practice of making and the risk involved in that, are such rich explorations of of how to be alive, you know, like the idea of giving up something you care so much about. Like that is just so powerful, you know, a gesture. Like not too many people are willing to give up that. The idea that there's something else there for you to learn from. So I think my creative practice, and the making in my creative practice, to also explore these, like just how to be fully immersed in like what it is to be alive, and what my doing.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'd like to bring Jiha and Tia into this too, if they have a question or comment.
Well, Matt, as you were speaking, it was just coming to me how much when I experience your work in person, that they have this really strong presence. And as you were saying, you're looking for, or asking questions just about being alive, it's almost like you have to ask that of yourself to imbue it in these objects, or for these objects to have that power in it. So that was my comment that I was sort of thinking about. I don't know if it leads exactly to a question, unless you want to comment on it in any way.
Like in order for them to work, I have to let them go. And I can't have a fixed idea of what they will be, because that kills its ability to become, you know, something. And so I think that's why, that's really that thing that makes my work function for me, and as objects that kind of really hold this, and suspend hold this act, this kind of like devotional act of like being curious and letting go, exploration itself. Like that has to be, those conditions have to be like allowed for that to emerge in order for my work to make any sense to me, or for it to kind of, for it to work. Yeah.
I have a question for Jiha, and that is,
yes.
Are you there? Okay.
Yes, I am listening.
Your ability to hybridize has been an important life skill, and a highly functional tool for you in art as well. your ceramic art is really fascinating to me, and I think it's remarkably inventive. And you have hybridized powerful cultural forces from the East and the West, as well as diverse artistic talents in order to work with clay in the unique way that you do. After all, ceramics offers you the opportunity to draw, to paint, to engage color, and to sculpt all at once. And so can you please discuss the power of hybridization in your life and in your ceramics practice?
Yeah, I actually wrote like a lengthy answer and I read it about 10 times, but I think I'm just gonna go after I heard Matt is talking about his process in his studio. It really makes sense just to kind of go naturally and talking about, I guess, in terms of hybridization, what's happening in my studio. So it took a while for me to get my studio where I want it to be. Before then, I had used a community studio. So I would drive like 40 minutes to get there and then work about a few hours. And then I come back home and bring some stuff and then paint and draw, make stuff at home and then bring it to community studio. And about 4 years ago, we found this place where I could have my painting studio and my ceramic studio and my job that I teach at Georgia State. So I could go all 3 places all the time. And I just realized time is ticking and time is very important. So I needed to, in order for me to work efficiently, I have to have all my studio in my home and where I could also take care of my son, my husband, and my 2 dogs. So I felt like my life and my art practice is almost inseparable. They're very bonded. Sometimes I have to work in my ceramic studio and then I get really stuck and I jump to my painting studio, work on my painting. And almost I feel like I will kind of jump to avoid my problem in a way that I don't really destroy or punish the project that I've been working on. And I just almost wanted to hang on to it because I know that I'm not fully understand what I'm doing at the moment. So I just try to give myself more break. So I jump into one studio to another. And it's been like that over last, I guess, over more than 5 years now. So for me, I been a painter for a long time. And that was my biggest question when I came to the United States. And I see a lot of people doing different things. And I was really attracted to abstract, expressionism. And those paintings were really exotic to me. I wanted to be part of the community. And I just kind of pretend like I wanted to make those paintings. And it was a biggest struggle for me. And then I realized, I want to bring work with the figuration, iconography, colors and patterns and all the symbolism work with my culture. I wanted to bring that to my painting practice and I have to go back to figuration again. So there's a big really debate between figuration and abstraction. And then as soon as I started with ceramic practice, I started out as love of the objects because when I make my paintings, I look at my painting and I always struggle so much of how much I have to negotiate and layers I have to deal with. So I kind of feel like people don't have that kind of problem when they look at the object-based work because people are so unguarded and they love they love objects in general. So if you visit your parents' house, your grandparents' house, there's always little, table, they collect stuff and they travel, go around, collect stuff. And I look at them and people are really unguarded and they're very friendly. They love collecting things from all over the place. And I've been really wondering about how can I make my painting and drawing language on the surface of object that translate it really well. And people are unguarded. They're not really uptight when they look at the painting in white space or museum or gallery, or they're that like traditional thing on the wall, people get scared of and what the hell that is about, They always ask questions and they're just like, if they don't understand, they want the direct answer right away. So I felt like the power of objects, the object would sort of like unguarded people and they become more friendly. They want to touch things and they want to like sort of project their experience. So I guess for that, you know, I started learning how to deal with that and make stuff with object-based work. And I was really excited about, that's how I got into like the clay world. And I practice, my practice is not just making, but also making an observation within the community. And where, you know, in fine art painting world, there's like, you know, abstract painting, figurative painting, there's high art and low art. You know, people constantly trying to distinguish and categorize things because of their comfort level. But in the ceramic studio, there's a kind of similar thing, but a different way. And there's a potter who are really focused on functional potter, trying to make things really perfect. There's on the other side, people who are making more sculptural things, and then people like call them, oh, they're just decoration. They're decorated on the surface. So I felt like all of a sudden my painting gesture become decorative when it goes onto ceramic surfaces. And I got offended at first, but for me, I kind of felt like that's a big sort of like learning social, I guess like a social status or socially I'm making observation. So it got me really excited about I'm making a vessels or like cups, and I put them together to make a figurine. And then I start like poking with it. I start being kind of mischievous, making things like, you know, unusable. And people start asking me like, what are you doing? Are you gonna put candle inside? And I was like really excited about, can it be just what it is? Like it doesn't have to have a function. So that's where I kind of start understanding of like how people interact with the objects. So the hybridization kind of become very important because as a person, you know, coming from Korean background and living in the United States almost 20 years, and I feel myself more Americanized. I consider myself Korean American. When I go back to Korea, people kind of see the differences and they really sort of criticize or sort of like give me observation, their point of view, like, you know, you're very Americanized. But I'm here, then people are kind of like, oh, you're Korean, you probably know about tradition and all that. And I have to tell them like, well, actually, I'm just learning as much as you learn from internet and looking at the books and talking with people. So the hybridization become very important for my practice conceptually and I guess material-wise, technically as well. So it kind of goes like all different way. And at the end of the day, I feel like I'm making things that is sort of not so easy to identify, but it has its own identity. I guess almost like a joke, I say to people, my best hybridization of things that I make is my son, because he's perfect, he's mischievous, he's funny, and he's troublemaker. And then you can't really tell whether he's like, you know, really Asian or really like Caucasian. He's half and half. But wherever he goes to, he started looking different. So I felt that like my goal to make art something mysterious has its own identity, that perfect hybridization of like everything.
Jiha?
Sacredness, some of the vessels and the kind of the attention to the tying and the braiding, there's like an element of the sacred. And also in the paintings, there's this kind of like ethereal mindscape, like almost yeah, out of this, there's a sacredness to the spaces, you know, that's created. Do you think about that and how you tie or kind of how you allow those vessel forms to come into the world, or how you see those wall pieces, the kind of the nodding, your engagement with them as an object? Do you think about that?
That's a very hard question. I actually, like, one other thing I'm really interested in is like a folk art around the country, not just Korea, but in America, also everywhere else. And then also, I guess, this may be related to your question a little bit about people's belief system. Like, for me, I used to be religious, but not so much anymore because I start questioning, and then I look at people's behavior who are religious, and I just kind of like feel that that's not the right way to go. And it has all kinds of questions. And also my family is surprisingly Christian in Korea, and it kind of combined with the local sort of belief system as well. So my mom, for example, when I took a test to go to college, that was a biggest deal for like a little people in Korea, like, in high school. And my mom's super religious, but then she went to see the fortune teller, like, to find out whether I'm gonna get accepted or not. So I asked question like, you're religious, isn't that against your God? Why'd you do that? And she's like, it's okay. He or she will forgive. Like, I just wanted to kind of get a good energy. So my work is a lot about also that. So I kind of start looking at mischievous behavior, like Pennsylvania Dutch. It's like American folk art, but we can't really pinpoint the origin. Another example is like, I always kind of feel like a Cheshire cat is kind of funny and scary at the same time. I don't know if this is kind of related to your question, but I kind of look at those like a belief system and then ritual things and kind of look at it and sort of trying to combine with my work and the object as well. So part of the reason I used those dreadlocks or hairstyle that I also look at Korean folk art and then try to combine those hand knotted elements and then sort of give a little bit of life or also hybridize with the other material besides just ceramic. So it become more than, one thing. So I don't know if they will add more energy or maybe it's a little bit personalized, make it look like a character related or ritually related, and sort of a itty bitty of every element, like you kind of guess and then see what's going on, but you can't really pinpoint. But a lot of those things that I'm thinking about when I make work.
Jiha?
Yes.
When I look at your painting in particular, and a little bit in your ceramics, I can really feel Korean folk art. And when I think of what I know about Korean folk art, I think that there is a lot of mischievousness and humor in it. And you've mentioned that several times. So when you work with ceramics, though, it's something that you know less about the history of ceramics, and ceramics is kind of a low art in many cultures in many ways. And so, and you mentioned how friendly it is and open it is. Does it put you in a different position as a maker when you're working with ceramics and vessels to be more playful and to be more mischievous and not to have as much weight on you as when you paint?
I have to confess that it's true. This is kind of crazy analogy. I always tell people my painting is like my husband and my ceramic work practice is almost like my new boyfriend. I should not say that anymore. It's like my son, right? The new thing. And I know in any process of it, it may mess things up. So I try not to expect too much. And also I kind of like that collaboration, like it's going through the kiln process and then something's gonna happen and it could mess things up, then I have to make again. So I felt that it's okay. Like it's okay to break things. It's okay to make mistake, then I'll make a second piece again. But for painting, I've been painting for a long time. So I've been more critical of what I do. And I guess like I punish myself a lot. And that's not happening in ceramic surfaces. Like, if something messes up and come out and I'll try, okay, I won't use that green like on the glaze again because it just burn off and I'll use different technique. So it's more critical, but ceramic practice, it kind of make me loosen up to my painting as well. So it's really kind of good to have both. So my perspective, the way I deal with the situation become more forgivable and practical, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I would like to move on. I've got a question for Tia now. Tia, as you create ceramic sculpture, it appears to be a delicate negotiation between the real, the surreal, the romantic, and the ideal in order to arrive at the poetry that is your work. Can you discuss how you navigate those powerful boundaries in your work as you make things?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. I think that in each of those elements, it sort of shows my interest in this sort of vast world of where me as a human, we as collective humans sort of exist within the world as a natural sort of phenomenon and with the nature around us. I sort of came to it just as that, from that like innocent and naive point of view of just wanting to play with the animals in the zoo and like, you know, feed the squirrels, and not understanding how when we interact with wild animals, it's dangerous or, you know, possibly not the best thing for them. So I think that's where the animal work started. And also looking at art history and just the art that I was drawn to. I was always, you know, if there was a dog in the corner of the Renaissance painting, I was there, you know, looking at that, trying to figure out what was going on there. I've always loved animals and had them around when I was growing up. And then one of the first animal works I made was called Without Territory, Without Boundary, and it was a stack of 3 animals on top of each other. And the first animal was a unicorn, a made up animal, and then a ram and a deer. Oh, thank you. So yeah, so this piece, and I think that this piece sort of embodies sort of the answer to that question. And as I was making this piece, there's a few things going through my mind, but one of the things I was starting to realize was that domesticated animals, you know, it is a sort of symbiotic process, you know, where dogs and humans come together. But I found out that they had tried to domesticate white-tailed deer, and it didn't really work. So the idea of domestication, it's sort of the animal has to be have certain characteristics that can be domesticated, and you know, it was sort of a back and forth. It was the first time I sort of reversed the roles of that idea, that possibly the idea of domestication was beneficial to the dog, and even though as a human we sort of put on a pedestal the independent nature of wolves, right? So I was sort of thinking about all of those things as I started, and that was one of my first animal works. And then as I went, I just started to notice how I saw animals in the world. A lot of times it was in zoos, but with the rabbit in particular was a great experience where I was walking in the desert outside of Los Angeles in Joshua Tree, and a jackrabbit came up and was on the trail about 10 feet in front of me and stopped and like looked back and sort of turned his body. And it, you know, I'd seen jackrabbits before, but it was a real visceral experience of like, wow, what is this creature? And the ears and the power of it. So, you know, I kind of switched from just making animals that I was kind of fascinated by to with this piece, making an animal that I actually had sort of a real life nature encounter. But I will echo, you know, some of the things I think that maybe are similar between my process and maybe all artists, and especially the artists in this panel, is that while I work and sculpt on these pieces, it allows me a time to just focus and meditate on the subject matter that I'm working on, and think about, you know, what these rabbits do, and if there's any mythology behind the subject matter, and what that might be, and does that play into the read of this work. So as I have made some rabbit sculptures, I've, had fun looking at the fantasies and myths and different things and the way this sort of symbol or archetype of an animal is seen throughout different the different lenses of the world. So I think that, all of those different interests sort of lead into how these get read in that space of maybe a little bit fantastical, but hyper realistic.
Do you see a big difference? I mean, between that shift of like being interested in animals, and then in kind of like building these narratives around historical, representation of animals, versus making a work like specifically from this experience you had, in the desert, like that's such a different narration of the object, or in terms of how the object kind of emerges. Like one's this kind of curation, and one's this it's not curated event, it's like the idea that that's an experience of life that kind of emerged in the kind of working with that object, is this kind of like reconciliation with that experience, this personal experience, and how that differentiates between maybe your other works. I've been dealing that with in my own work recently, of like realizing these pulling my lived experience as the reference point to my practice, and the works seem different. They seem real more ritual. It seems like this devotional practice a little bit, to just acknowledging this my experience, versus like the idea of art history or something. I'm not sure for you if that was a significant shift in how you chose to allow that work into your practice.
Yeah. So the way I kind of see it is that, in a way, even though I was working with these animals that were sort of from my imagination or just something I was curious about, they were, the scale of them was on this domestic animal size, and they were in poses that my dogs would potentially be in. And so the departure to this rabbit or jackrabbit piece was really, I would say yes, it definitely changed the shift in that even though the rabbits are a little bit bigger than life size, they're not in this domesticated size. And so as much as I have continued to make work that contains animals in it, I see these pieces as almost completely different than some of my earlier works, though, categorically speaking, others might just see it, oh, she's made another animal work. But yeah, the ones that are from that sort of real life experience take on a different life, I'd say, than the other works.
You have a really different kind of relationship to kind of sculpting in a way than a couple of the other panelists, people in the group, because I think for some of the other works, there's this like acceptance of what ceramics could become, or there's this participation with the material of like not knowing, or allowance of unknown language to kind of emerge. And I think your work it has a different level of like kind of persistence in its articulation, in its craftsmanship, and its kind of control over that idea, versus like, I don't know, how do you think about like control in your practice versus in what parts of your practice do you let go of control?
Yeah. Well, I can start by just saying that like observation and my eyes, have been something that I really rely on, that as a meditate, like as just my calmest moments are sitting and observing and watching the silhouettes of the landscape or whatever it happens to be. So that translated, in my early art days into, sketching with a graphite pencil. And as soon as I touched clay, I was like, wow, I can sketch in 3-dimensional space. And for me, I am sort of using it just as a sculptural material in the sense that it's a lot easier to carve than wood or stone. But I do tend to build it up and carve it away to get that precise form. But I think it's it doesn't feel like a controlling sort of situation in the exploration of it. But I'll say that also I usually have an image or something I'm kind of working for or looking for, because like I said, that's where I really like to rest it on my eyes, observing it and sort of translating it through that. But I'm not super obsessed with getting it looking absolutely lifelike. I'm really kind of interested in how much needs to be there to bring forth what needs to be there and what doesn't. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but there is sort of a looseness in how I interpret what I'm working for from real life. Like, it's not necessarily a pursuit to mimic or cast real life. It's more just a pursuit of investigating what my eye sees and translating that into three-dimensional space.
Yeah, I think it's like a vulnerability of allowing one's own hand to be present, you know, and in one's own quirks and peculiarities and how they mark and render, and like that's, I think that can allow a tremendous amount of like unknown and exploring, you know, that happens, and understanding how you articulate and how you make marks and what you allow and what you don't allow.
Yeah.
Another,
And actually, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Tia.
I was just going to say, actually, that is a really fun part of the process in that middle stage when you have sort of a form built up, is just like putting on little blobs of clay to like see if you can get like a curve or a wrinkle or some sort of gesture that's like a little bit more juicy than maybe what, you know, the image is from real life. And when you're sculpting, you can kind of exaggerate that a little bit more. So there's a lot of play that goes in as I'm sort of finding those moments.
You know, I'm just looking at your work, and they're entirely hand modeled, I take it, and so they're made by hand. They're based in touch and response to material, and then the finish, though, it's more like a cool industrial finish, which kind of makes it more impersonal or more archetypal or something. It's a very interesting position between the industrial and the hand. Is there something you can say about that?
Sure. I can start by also saying that, yeah, in the beginning, actually with that piece that was shown earlier, the Without Territories piece, I was looking at a lot of cars. I just moved back to LA, and you know, LA is a city of cars. And so as I was playing with this idea of what our role is in nature as humans and how we've sort of pushed nature into these areas that we deem are natural preserves and things like that, I started to cover the animals with an actual car automotive paint. And then it's transmuted, it's translated into, you know, a paint surface, a painted surface. But yeah, that actual covering is very durable, and maybe that has conceptual ramifications of you know, speaking to the fragility of these animals, the fragility of the clay, and things like that. I'm not necessarily opposed to glaze. Some of the works do get glazed and lustered as well, but often I use a paint surface as well.
I think you know, if you think about so many people that work with clay, and they have their hands all over the clay, and they leave that signature, their own personal touch and mark making, and it makes the work really personal in a way. But it seems like you're removing yourself from the equation directly, the way a lot of people that work with clay do, and allowing this thing to stand more on its own. A little. So the word I come up with is kind of archetypal. It becomes more archetypal in a way. It moves in that direction and allows you to think thoughts that I think the viewer thinks thoughts that I think are not so directly related to the hand, personal expression, individual expression of the maker. I just find that really interesting because you don't see that a lot in ceramics. You don't see it in clay.
I think that also kind of leads the more drama to the piece because I see some of the like forms very simple but really slick automotive paints, and they kind of talks about like technology and like a hyper like the place that we're living. So I also think about post-apocalyptic kind of like a scene like where people pushes and technology so much where the nature is gonna be end up. And I don't know, this is like the narrative, like it's kind of creating in my own head, just looking at these creatures, and they're very mythical, but they're also very like removed, the feelings kind of removed, but it creates like that type of drama for me.
Do you see the plastic, some of the paint coatings as like a repressive, or as a toxic, or as a something fear, or do you see
Maybe.
it as something that's like beauty and refinement? Tia.
To me,
Yeah. In terms of plastic coating, and is that a violence, or is that a beauty? Does that make sense?
yeah. I guess I don't see it as a violence. I see it more as a beauty. I see it. The work really doesn't come to life for me until it has the color on it. When it is just the raw clay color, the clay body, it still feels like a shell of the piece, and I really don't have much idea where this piece is going to be in space until I see the color of on it. So I see it more as just a vehicle for the color, and then the color brings to me the element of maybe the fairy tale or the surreal nature of the work. It, especially with the pastel pieces, this one that we're looking at, it is kind of light and soft, a color that is sometimes used with babies or children or something like that. So all of those things are kind of coming into play as I'm choosing the color. So I see it more as a framing element in that sense.
Hey, Tony, I think I should ask you a question, no?
Okay. Ready?
Yeah. Good to me. I was trying to think of a question for you, and I'd written, one of the ideas was just like, what are you searching for? But then I realized like I was having a hard time answering that for myself, in that like the things that, it wasn't really about searching for a specific thing, but about kind of an uncovering and an uncovering of knowledge, and an exploration of thought that is kind of like teaching, that is like as a form of teaching. And so I think for me, I think what I thought maybe a better word or a better question would be like, what are you finding right now? I think for me, it's like in the COVID, I think my mind has been just transitioned so much conceptually in a really vulnerable way, that it seems like I'm learning so much about myself as a maker and my practice as an artist, whatever, and the things that I'm generating. And I was just curious for you, like what you're finding in your studio and your practice right now that's kind of, really different from what you found maybe in the past.
Well, I feel like my work, thanks, Matt. I feel like my work has always been designed in a way to incite learning. I mean, it's how I learn, through my work, and it's not just, I don't just make things. My work teaches me. And the interesting thing about having worked now for I think I can count the years, you know, since the 70s really, is that when you first start working, I feel like you follow your instincts and you know, and I've learned how to do that very well. I'm a very instinctual maker. But as you learn, you acquire little bits of information, you know, and gradually that information kind of adds up to some kind of knowledge, you know. And as you keep working and keep paying attention and keep building, maybe that knowledge starts to become kind of a maker's wisdom, you know. Hopefully you end up with that. And so I rely on that, and I feel like in the studio that's what I'm looking for. I want to use that wisdom, if you know, whatever it is I've got, and I want to keep building it. And so I try to put myself in position in the studio, COVID or non-COVID, you know, to just keep learning. And I feel like, you know, there's only, you know, it's very hard to stay as active as I've stayed in the studio for so long. And the way that I do it is that I'm just constantly chasing my curiosity. You know, I'm curious about a lot of things, and kind of like the deeper I go, the more curious I become about stuff. And so I just try to act on that curiosity. And then what comes of that is that I'm rewarded. You know, I get rewards for my curiosity. And if you can put up number 13 there, I think that'll, you know, so every artist needs rewards. And I think the most profound rewards that kind of really stimulate growth and stimulate, you know, constant forward activity in the studio is the reward of discovery. And so my curiosity leads me to discovery. That's my reward. It's very exciting to me. I hop out of bed every day. I can't wait to get to the studio and see what's up. And, you know, so those internal rewards, I feel, are kind of what fuel me, my curiosity and those internal rewards. That's what I'm really looking for always. I feel like that's the basis for what I do. And then, you know, I think those lead you to external rewards too. And I think external rewards are really important. And, you know, so the opportunity to exhibit work, or to sit on a panel like this and talk, you know, with 3 wonderful artists, and just to be recognized for what you do, or you know, appreciated by the culture you're in. And so those are external rewards. And so you just try to keep the balance between the external and the internal fluid, you know, so one doesn't overweigh the other. But I feel like I understand that very well, and so I keep that in mind all the time. And so I think that's what I'm doing, really. It's really simple. And it's been that way for a long time, actually.
How do you deal with like the unknown? Like, it seems like the past 10 years or something, you've really allowed kind of the unknown into your work. I guess different. I think there's been unknown in the perforated vessels, but there was a significant shift in your practice. I think that was really liberating for me creatively, just to see that progression through idea. And I know there's a lot of similarities between that earlier work. I mean, the earlier work, which for me, as in how I knew you, you know, was the work I saw. You know, the first things would be the perforated vessels. Mm-hmm. So for me to see you make this huge shift creatively as an artist, and kind of leaping forward, letting yourself move forward, there's so many more elements of unknown that I saw you engaging and being curious about.
Yeah.
That were emerging and that you were allowing to take place. Each decision of color was not, you know, a decision you didn't know what would happen. You know, in those tests, you know, those aren't known tests. You know, those are explorations of surface and of uncertainty. You know, and
I mean, isn't that the definition of being experimental? You don't know what's going to happen. If you know what's going to happen, it's experimental. So I like being in that position. I feel like it's very exciting. You get to be kind of an explorer, you know, and that's exciting, because when you're an explorer, you come across discovery, you know, and when you discover stuff, that's, you know, that's very rich. So I also find that I kind of go after, I stay within the subset of the vessel, kind of the ceramic vessel, but it's not culturally based. It doesn't look like work from Japan or France or any, you can't really name it like that, but they are known, like Jiha says, they're familiar to us. And so I use them, as subject matter that way. And it's a very rich history. So it's endless to me, but I find myself kind of chasing down the things that I'm most frightened by. I've been chromophobic, in my work, and I've been very restrained in my work for years, and a lot of decorum, I think, and so I kind of just want to go against that stuff. I want to rage against that a little bit, not, as much as I find courage to do it. I find myself in arguments, with the history of the way you make and the way things look, and so I want to at least have a polite discussion, if not an argument about that. So this piece here on the screen was fired upside down, just simply because I didn't like being subjected to the gravity in the way that I was, so for so long in so many ways, and lots of other things. But I think really at the heart of all of it is curiosity, and also the ability to listen to little whispers, somewhere in the back of my mind. That whole shift in those crucible vessels, that are on display now, started about 10 years ago. And I like to work on things with rigor, sometimes I'll work on a series of things for about 10 years, and try to exhaust it, try hard to exhaust it. And then when I do, I'll find something else that I'm equally curious about and move along. And so I just feel like you learn those things about your practice as a maker, and the things that will sustain you, and the things that move you forward. And I like challenging. I like being challenged. I like being in an argument in my work, and so I find myself kind of trying to go at things that I feel that I'm lacking in, or insufficient in, or scared of, or something like that. But yeah, little whispers. I think we're kind of running up on about an hour. I'm just wondering if we might turn it over to Elizabeth, if there's any questions in the audience. It's a long time to ask the audience to sit and wait, but they may have questions for Jiha, Tia, Matt, or myself, or just the group in general. We'd love to field those. So bring it back Elizabeth here. Thank you.
Sorry, the host was not allowing me to reappear. Well, first of all, thank you all. This has been an amazing conversation. I wish actually it could go on further. We do have a number of questions. One of the questions that actually came in advance of today was about art historical references. Actually, Tia had touched upon in her response to one of the questions, but for anybody who wishes to take it, I wondered if anybody could specifically expand or make reference to how important art historical references have been on your work. Perhaps beginning with you, Tony.
Well, I mean, the history of pottery and ceramics is it's pan-cultural. It goes back as far as the earliest sightings of culture all over the world, and so it's massive, and it presents really interesting problems. It's a minor art in many ways, so it hasn't even been studied that well, not like painting or anything, but it is an enormous backdrop. I mean, I know it pretty well, but most people don't. But it's an enormous backdrop against which you work, and so I feel like the interesting thing for me is that I try to slip through the cracks of history. While I'm deeply inspired by pottery and ceramics from all over the world through all time, I think it's so unique, so fascinating, so powerful to me. Yet I don't want to identify with it in my work. I don't want my work to be identified with it clearly, and obviously, so you can point to it. So that's a really interesting trick. How do you slip through the cracks of history when there's such a massive history? And so that's the thing that I think about a lot.
I've been thinking similarly about how the history of ceramics being so large, and maybe some of the objects, the oldest objects of art being kind of clay objects, had nothing to do with really art, like they were, it was this kind of like devotional act or seeing images in an object, you know, and it, or trying to render. There's this like spiritual act, I feel like, to like early works that I think for me, as a maker today, I find freedom in, because they don't seem, and they didn't seem to have to kind of perform within the concept of art. They were something else. There was some other exploration of thinking and experience that was taking place, rather than kind of work in relation to art history, or work in relationship to cultural, I don't know, to this kind of like art conversation. It was something else. And I think for me as a maker recently, that's been really influential, to think that there's a way of engaging creativity, even outside of the genre of art, but as just this exploration of being alive, that I think ceramic history kind of allowed me a platform to kind of engage that, because especially in school, you know, I think there was somehow insulated from the kind of conversation of art. I could kind of function within that dialogue, and I didn't know why I could function in that space while feeling protected in some manner. And I think some of it has to do with these like historical things that were made that weren't really made for the reasons of art, you know, what we deem as art today. And I think for me, so I think that's really it's exciting as becoming like a body of work and exploration of images and the way the mind works, as just this kind of like cognitive exploration of being alive, that the history of ceramics has like inspired me, or I guess the history of objects in general, but the earliest objects have kind of allowed that to take place now in my practice.
Great. Another question that came in was about the use of color, and I think specifically for Tia, whether there is meaning in the color that you choose. And I know the answer to that question myself, and maybe you can talk about the color of the piece that we have in our show.
Sure. Yes. So there's a lot of meaning in the color of that is chosen. I specifically chose a light purple because it was bringing together both light pink and light blue into one color, which I think is kind of interesting. It also relates to some of the narrative and myth that I think about as I'm creating the piece. This is Hesperus' Phosphorus hair, and Hesperus and Phosphorus are the name for the planetary body Venus in the sky, and it's one of the brightest bodies in the sky besides the moon. And so morning star and evening star are what Hesperus and Phosphorus stand for, and it's the planet Venus, and the color purple is often associated with that. So as I choose the color for the piece, all of that is sort of thought about in this. I will say that with my work, a lot of times I'll make one piece, but I have this idea for a series because, as many of my fellow artists here have mentioned, that, you know, as you sort of work something out, you kind of, I work it out through the piece. And so over my shoulder is a light blue hair, and which was the predecessor to this, you know, lavender hair. And there is sort of this idea that there would be sort of a pastel rainbow of rabbits in all the different colors, and that as I work with a light yellow or a light green, that I would kind of understand what those colors, or how those colors have been used in art history, or how they might be used in color theory, or just sort of make up my sort of emotional response to how I feel when I see yellow. So it's kind of sunny, so maybe the rabbit would have a different position, or, you know, would have something to do with that. So that's where the color comes into my work usually.
Would anyone else like to talk about color in their work? Jiha?
Well, I guess for this exhibition, I have pieces that has a lot of yellow in it. The idea, I start out as a sort of example from like 60s pop artists, Louis Wittgenstein's, like, you know, the blonde, you know, locks on beautiful Western beauties. But here alone, it become a wave. And in my painting as well, sort of take on a different meaning. So I titled it Yellow Wave Rose. Actually, those roses that you see, they are not Korean folk art, but they're also from tattoo references. But people kind of recognize that as like Korean folk art, which I'm okay with it. And I think it's kind of fun misunderstanding. But here, the yellow wave, I also thinking about how racially people recognize Asian people as yellow, although we are not emoji or like minion. We don't really have yellow skin, but they call, like, you know, Asian people yellow. So it's almost like making fun of myself in a way, but then also sort of like looking at this color as a color experience. You know, there's a different take on, like, this can be Western beauty talking about blonde hair, but at the same time in 21st century, it could be racial term. And I sort of talk about Asian representation, how lack of it in this country. So in a way, I wanted to make a feast, like almost like celebrate kind, like with a lot of yellow. So, and then here it's a very quick calligraphic mark making. And so the speed of brush stroke is really fast. And then I go around and, you know, draw every single lines with black. So it is really kind of time consuming as well. So I'm kind of juxtapose using color as a brush stroke, something really fast versus something really slow.
Great, thank you. And Matt, I know the spectrum of colors changed quite dramatically from the time that we first showed your work. Very primary colors, and the most recent show actually had, in some instances, very little color. So I was wondering if you could just talk about what your thinking is with the use of colors, but actually with the more recent work entirely that we've seen we can share with.
Behind me, you know, these are some like pretty recent works. In the one on the show, this kind of relates to the piece in the show, the kind of two figures together, and I think those, yeah. So I think there's this kind of, it started as this engagement with Myelica history because I was looking at them and as a reference point to kind of painting history, and wanting kind of a ground. These pieces were a way of color and faces to emerge, or a context at which an object can emerge out of. And I think color just becomes this kind of, for me, has been just this marker, as Tony said earlier, of just this exploration of thought and this kind of, this, you know, grabbing color and placing it on, and the freedom to be able to just have all the colors around you and just intuitively just try to explore where your mind is at and how you begin to reconcile with the form in the creation of these things. And so I think there's this free aspect, the freeing aspect in working with color to allow it to take place. There's this kind of disruptive aspect to it a lot of times, in terms of it kind of being this kind of like burden on the form underneath it. There's this kind of letting go of letting go to see how an object can emerge that takes place. I love these pieces where the surface is just, it's frozen. A lot of my mark making is really just the act that it took to generate the form. And it was the mark that pushed the clay up, you know, and letting that be just this obvious exploration, raw exploration of thinking. And so for in these pieces, the piece of the gallery, I really love how the glaze itself didn't melt. Like in my other works, all of the drips are just from the act of painting, which was a nice kind of break for me, because the earliest works were any kind of mark making was the act of glaze melting. And And so as my work became more about this kind of exploration of, or as I saw my participation in the work, the making of the work was a conceptual element of engagement as well. And an exploration of that engagement as well as the subject matter. As I was working, I become more interested in letting that mark the kind of exploration of that and the struggle and kind of doubt and the fear and the reluctance and the uncertainty and the certainty, like all of these emotions being able to kind of take place in that act of mark making and letting them be, instead of having them then be transformed through the kiln into some kind of a phenomena. So I think that's been a shift in my work of letting the vulnerability of that reconciliation of ideas and self knowledge and lack of knowledge be present in the kind of exploration of this object.
Great, thank you. Is there anything you would like to say in conclusion, Tony? We are kind of pretty much out of time right now, so
I can wrap
I
up.
hate to bring this to a close, but there are a number of other questions which I'd be happy to forward on to the panelists if they want to answer either through the gallery or directly with people who have posed them. We have recorded this event, so it will be made available for everyone. I'm happy to say thank you to everyone who turned up to watch this and to participate. Thank you, of course, to all our amazing panelists, and to everyone out there. Please come visit if you are able. If you're in the Los Angeles area, we are open as long as we possibly can be before we're shut down and locked down. We're open by appointment. Visiting is very safe. We observe all the protocols. As I say, the show will be up through January 16th. We also have a very rich virtual program. Our next event is a conversation between two painters, Rebecca Campbell and Sarah Awad, which will happen on December 2nd. But there will be more to come, so many more events up ahead. But again, thank you to everyone. Keep safe out there. Happy Thanksgiving. And look forward to seeing you in this space sometime soon, and in person, I hope.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Good luck, everyone.
Good luck. Bye.